so the big question just becomes like, can you, and this is a big question with people who are kind of wrestling with Taylor and people who don't like Taylor or are pushing back, is like, how really disenchanted are we? And could you re-enchant the world? Like, could you even maybe in enclaves, say maybe just your church, could you re-enchant it for them? I'm not sure you can, to be honest. I'm more on the you can never necessarily re-enchant the world, because the enchantment's embedded in institution structures, So until airlines are like, come and fly our airline because we cast out demons when we clean the plane, like no one would ever fly that airline, not in the West, maybe in other places in the world, but definitely not in the West. Be like, I am never, ever getting on that airplane, which maybe shows we're also not quite as modern as we think we are. But, I don't know that you can re-enchant it, but one of the things you can really do that I think is very important that takes us beyond Charles Taylor is I do think you can re-personalize the world. I do think you can soak the world again in a certain sacramental reality.
Have you noticed in our modern moment that Christian belief seems more and more unbelievable to more and more people? Why might that be, and how should the church respond? These questions and more are what we're discussing on today's episode of the Form.Life podcast. I'm Bill Gorman, campus pastor at the Brookside campus.
And I'm Paul Brandis, campus pastor at the Shawnee campus. And today, it was a joy to be joined on our episode by one of our regular guest hosts, Gabe Coyle, who serves as the campus pastor at our downtown campus. And we were able to have Dr. Andrew Root join us for a rich discussion on how the church might respond to the realities of an increasingly secular age.
Dr. Root earned his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary and is one of today's leading scholars both on youth ministry and practical theology. He has written extensively and broadly, including a series of books inspired by Dr. Charles Taylor's influential work, A Secular Age.
Yeah, Dr. Root and his work have long impacted my life and leadership, and so it was a joy to visit with him, and I can't wait for you to listen in. So let's join the conversation now. Andy, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us on the Form.Life podcast today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We were talking before we logged on and started recording. I was first introduced to your work. We've got a partner organization here at Christ Community called Youth Front, and that's my background in vocational ministry, is working with students and young people. And so that's how I got to know you and your work first, was in that space, as you've done a lot of great work on student ministries over the years. And but you've also done a bunch of other stuff as well. So I'm just fascinated. I know a little bit of this, but for a reminder for me and then for our listeners, I'd love to start by just asking you to share a bit of your story, and however you want to take that, but maybe especially the work that God has allowed you to do over your life and career, and what you've gotten to be a part of. I'd love to start there and kind of orient our listeners a bit to who you are.
Yeah, probably the best way to do it is just kind of work backwards. Sure. So, like starting today, what I do. No, you don't want to hear every piece of my life. Yes, every day of my life for at least the past 4 years, and see how long people hang on here. No, so I teach. I'm on the faculty at Luther Seminary, so I'm a professor here at Luther Seminary in the Twin Cities, and I have been doing that. I've been on the faculty here for 19 years. I'm finishing my 19th academic year here in a few weeks. So, it feels very fast, and I tell people I started when I was 12. So I'm not that old.
It was a risky hire. It was a risky hire for them.
It was a risky hire for a 12-year-old, but I've done well. But I'm here in a chair in youth and family ministry. So I came to Luther Seminary from Princeton Seminary, where I did my doctoral work, and I'm focused kind of on practical theology, focused a lot on young people and thinking about faith formation with young people. Ended up writing a dissertation on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and kind of thinking about relational ministry and what that actually is, and how do we think about that theologically, and so just have spent a lot of time. I mean, my early writing was in kind of towards young people, and in some ways, I think people now think that I've have somewhat outgrown that, which
Oh,
I
sure.
actually feel a deep shame about, because I don't feel like I've outgrown that. I feel like from the beginning, my questions really have been about, and I've tried to really drive towards the fact that youth ministry or children's ministry or ministry with students really is ministry, and there's something theologically rich about what that is.
Yes.
So that's been a nice, I wouldn't call it a pivot, but it's been a doorway into the last, I don't know, like 6-7 years, really thinking about broader forms of ministry and what that is, and this whole series I've done around a secular age, that is, I've been a big liar, because it was going to be a 3-volume series called Ministry in the Secular Age, and it turned into a 6-volume series, and then I promised people it'd be done, and there actually are other books that could be volume 7 and 8, but they won't be, just 'cause I can't stomach being too big of a liar. So, but yeah, I mean, all those have become more broad, kind of just thinking about Protestantism, thinking about pastoral ministry across the West in some ways. But I feel like there's real congruence all the way back to the youth ministry stuff, So I do feel a kind of need to write something again about youth ministry, or maybe even children's ministry. And I don't know, my experience, I don't know what you guys think, but since the pandemic, I think kind of an age-specific ministry, youth ministry particularly, has been kind of a loss, especially as a national conversation. That's all kind of dissipated. So I'd like to help in some way to give another book at least for people to reflect on. But so I grew up in a conservative Lutheran denomination. I'm married to a Presbyterian pastor. So Kara is a Presbyterian pastor here in the Twin Cities, and have 2 kids. I have a 19-year-old who's a freshman in college. I was going to make a joke about being 12 when he was born too, but
That's right.
I might be arrested. Like that also is a problem. That's actually not so funny when you get to it. But so that's been its own kind of existential journey, having a freshman in college, and then my daughter is a junior in high school. So time flies since I met you at one of those early youth front youth worker trainings.
Yeah, absolutely. That was in Kansas City, probably almost a decade ago. Which is that time does fly. I mapped the years for you that your start at Luther would have been also when you and your wife had your first kid. So that must have been a wild kind of start. All these
absolutely.
Years. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, we celebrated his first birthday like 4 months into the job.
Oh my gosh. So, wow. Lots of transition all at once.
Yeah, it's been crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Paul got to know you a little bit through the youth ministry stream and student ministries, but I got to know you by reading some of your more recent work, specifically around the secular age. And I would love, this is like a dream come true for me. I'd love for you to define in a short and pithy way, as best you can, the secular age for our listeners, and maybe even name, who would you say are some of those key thinkers or philosophers, or those who kind of put their finger on the pulse that have influenced the way you understand the secular age?
Yeah, well, as you know, I'm great at brevity after, a 3-book series going to 8. So, here we go. We'll see how this really goes. But there is something really at stake here. And I think that's something that's really fundamental for us to think about as we think about faith formation and just the witness of the church, is that the way we usually think about the secular is we think about it really through a framework of lost participation, and therefore institutional lack of vitality or something, so we'll say things, or the media will report that America is more and more of a secular place, or Western Europe is more and more of a secular place because fewer people are going to church, or church buildings are being turned into high-end lofts in urban areas, or microbreweries or something like that. And there's no doubt that is a trend, particularly in Western Europe, that's really clear. I mean, the American situation is so different in its own way, but even in the States, like the Pew Research study just I think it was 2 years ago, came out. And it was like the first time Americans self-reported under 50% of going to church. Now Americans always lie about how often they go to church. So we've been under 50% for a while, but there is something that talks about the imagination of this.
Yes.
And that really is when I'm talking about the secular, I'm building off these frameworks to think about the secular not as just a material participatory reality, but to think of it as a way we imagine ourselves, as the way we think about ourselves. And so there's a kind of transition of not really thinking about it in the sense of lost participation, but thinking about the secular or living in a secular age means that all forms of belief become quite fragile, that they become contested and fragile. We become very aware. We all are aware, I think, for the most part, that we could be believing something else. And for the most part, could get along fairly well within society. You know what I mean? Like we know the people across the street don't believe what we believe, and they go to all their kids' soccer games. You know what I mean? And you try to get out of as many of them as you can, or they get their cans in right after the garbage man has come through, So we're very aware there's different ways to be living. So that fragilizes us, but we just all live in a kind of milieu where we can say things and they seem quite logical. Like you can overhear people at a coffee shop saying, I just really need to take a break from God for a while. Like, I was part of this big mega church and now it's, things went bad for me or I'm just exhausted. So when I think of the things in my life that I need to cut out, I'm going to take a break from God for a while. Yeah. And for the most part, anyone who would overhear that at a coffee shop would be like, oh, yeah, I understand that. I mean, or, that seems logical. But for our ancestors, those before the modern period, to hear us say you were going to take a break from God would have been like saying you're going to take a break from air. It just was not a feasible thing. You couldn't even imagine how that occurred. So whatever it means to live in a secular age has this sense of a different kind of imagination where transcendence or this sense that there is a living, speaking God who moves throughout history becomes more and more unbelievable to people. And by that, I don't even mean that people take a direct rejection of the concept or the idea. They can just go a long way living without ever thinking about it. They can just kind of go a long way. And that's a different kind of cultural reality to live in that. So there also, however, is this deep push in this kind of secular age to make meaning. Like people feel a certain burden on their own shoulders to create meaning for themselves. So this becomes a very counterintuitive kind of secular age where you get all sorts of spiritualities inside of it because people need to go on some kind of quest to form their own meaning. So all of a sudden they do things like think, well, basically with religious devotion, join CrossFit or, get super into some kind of diet or find an app or a YouTube channel that gives their lives meaning that has this kind of spirituality connected to it. So there's a kind of counterintuitive dynamic here that's really about an imagination where this kind of secular age creates actually a buffet of spiritualities that people can choose from. And kind of classic forms of religion or classic forms of belief like Christianity and forms of Christianity like Protestant Catholicism, even like Islam and Buddhism and kind of classic forms become somewhat relativized, not as unimportant necessarily, but they become relativized on essentially the same level as CrossFit or getting your kid into Yale or running marathons or whatever other exercise you do. So I guess, that's the shorthand for a very long conversation. But the other element you asked is like, who am I drawing on this? And particularly for me, it is this Quebecois Canadian philosopher named Charles Taylor, who's written this big, thick 770-page book called A Secular Age, which he really just wants to answer a question of what's happened in the last 500 years in the West, that you get a complete flip where if you used to live in France or the Scandinavian countries or in London or something, you could not believe in God. It was impossible. And now that's completely flipped in those countries particularly, let alone in America. It has its own little nuances, but it's still happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Gabe, any thoughts there? Or I can kind of respond as well, but anything that arises in you or read it like from your reading of Andy or Charles Taylor? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll even just say from experience. Yeah, I've had conversations with folks where, they ask a pastor to have a conversation with them about a sensitive topic. And then I just ask the question, what do you think God thinks about that? And they kind of pause. Yeah. and look at me and say, I haven't even thought about that.
Yep.
It's fascinating that they reach out to me. And then when I ask that question, that still is not, even when they know I'm a pastor, when the question is posed, it's like, I'm not sure.
Same way I asked, and I've heard you say, you asked this too, I may have gotten it from you, but where is God in the midst of that?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, especially as I'm sitting in spaces as a pastor where there's something broken, like that's actually a question I am eager to ask. I mean, with sensitivity and humility, and ask it in a way that doesn't, sort of give space for them to say, I don't know, or I don't want to answer that, or I haven't thought about it. But I do similarly get a lot of that kind of, I don't know, or I haven't thought about it, or we're seeing it boots on the ground in the lives of people we get to serve, for sure. Yeah. And your work has helped us as pastors, and that's been kind of one of the volumes in the series is sort of pastors in a secular age, but also the congregation in a secular age. So that's really our primary listeners, and even folks not a part of our church, but are just seeking to be faithful followers of Jesus wherever that takes them on Monday, Tuesday, or the rest of the week. So how do you encourage people, whether again in your classes or your writing, what are some responses, like how to faithfully follow Jesus in the midst of this complete flip where it's, as you said, 500 years is just like, whoa, what's happened here? What are some ways we can respond? And how do you encourage people in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually a great deal of hope here. I mean, and part of the hope is this fragilization that I talked about is a kind of two-way fragilization. So, I mean, at one level, there's just the necessity, I think, pastorally and in the life of the church to acknowledge that people, and ourselves included, are going to have moments of fragilization. Like, you cannot exist inside of this cultural context and not have moments where you're thrust into doubt. This is just the reality that you live in. I mean, it's a little bit similar. This is maybe not completely right, but it would be really hard. It was nearly impossible to not believe in devils and demons, like to not believe that they were mobilized and moving if you lived, say, in the 13th century in Europe. And similarly for us, there's almost no way to escape this sense of fragilization where you're going to have moments where you wonder, like, is this true, or is this the family I grew up in? Or does religion really exist? Is it really true, or is this just an evolutionary trick? I mean, is this just pattern recognition writ large? You can't help that. That's going to happen unless you enter into some kind of rigid fundamentalist enclave. You will have those moments of fragilization. But it works the other way too, where if you're someone who doesn't believe and you've refused to believe, and you think all religion is a historical reality used by powerful people to keep other people down, that you think that people who think you go somewhere when you die are just ignorant, nervous, scared people who can't face the fact that your life is like a TV set that's on, and when you unplug it, it goes blank, and that's what happens when you die. Like, just face the facts. Taylor's point that I really am quite convinced by is that if that's you, if your belief system is that you don't believe, you too in this kind of secular age are going to have moments where your belief is fragilized and you have moments of believing. You're going to walk into a museum and see a painting and it's going to grab you, or you're going to go to a Christmas concert and it's going to be a Bach recital and all of a sudden that music's going to hit you, or you're going to have your first child and you're going to think there's no meaning in the world, and then this little being is going to grab for your hand and you're going to feel like you've known her forever. You're going to have these moments where even your unbelief is fragilized. So there's possibility there. And what that ultimately opens up for, I think, the church, for pastors, is to not be frightened of the fragility, but to walk into it. And
so good.
to walk with people and invite them to seek for meaning inside the fragilization itself, to journey. I think the question you both use is really right on, in the sense of like, well, what if we interrogate that experience, or what if we lean into it? What if we seek for God in it? And I guess your wager as a church, as a pastor, is that if you lean into that, you're going to find that God moves. But at another level, in this kind of secular age, you can't guarantee that.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, you, in some sense, in faith and hope yourself, have to invite people to have an open take, to lean in and search and see what they discover. But then I think you do need like classic Christian practices to do that in some ways. And so for me, a major piece of that is, how do you then teach people to become, or even churches that become, places of prayer? That prayer really is this kind of openness to possibility. And the other dynamic of that is, one of the things that happens, or one of the things that allows this kind of fragilization of belief, or allows us to kind of push God away or be unaware, is that just this reality that our lives are so accelerated and going faster and faster and faster and faster, that it even is really quite hard for us to make meaning. And we do feel this really internal sense, I think, that we have to optimize our lives, that we have to kind of perform ourselves in a certain way, that we can win some affirmation, that we can just do something good with our lives. Like our sense of the good life even is that we have to accomplish something, that we have to get something out of this. And I think that really does deeply burn people out. And I think there's a great hope in really having a disposition that what we do as a community is we wait on God, that we actually take on a posture of waiting. And that waiting isn't just kind of sitting on your hands, or the kind of terrible waiting, like when you're waiting for a software update to, go. Like, there's nothing worse than that. That's waiting is just awful. That's demonic waiting, actually. But it's the kind of waiting where you're anticipating the possibility that this God might move, that you're waiting with a story, that you're waiting, and this prayer itself is a form of waiting. So I just learned recently that the beautiful Psalm, "Be still and know I am God," that one way you can render that in the Hebrew is, "Put down your hands and know that I am God," which is really a beautiful way to think about it. And I think late modern, upwardly mobile, middle-class people have very busy hands. Like, one of the ways to cope with the meaninglessness of our time is just stay busy. Keep your kids busy. You stay busy. Just stay busy. And maybe you'll tumble into your dream somehow, and you'll live in some way. And yet most people just end up ravaged by that, just burnt out and depressed, and so on and so forth. And there's something incredibly healing. It's scary. It's existentially frightening to stop, to wait. And it's asking a lot of God, that God would move. And I think there's a lot of pastors who don't really trust that God will move, to tell people to wait and enter into a disposition of prayer. I think sometimes people in ministry feel like that would be ministerial malpractice, because what if God doesn't move? And the response to that is, well, then what's the point anyhow? You know what I mean? Like,
right. Yeah, exactly.
Do you have a streaming service? It's kind of better than a lot. There's a lot going on here. There's we're not in the 11th century where the only image you're ever going to see is in a church, or the only music you're ever going to hear is by walking into a church. People have Spotify. So, we don't get to be the only entertainment outlet in town, like Christendom once was. So if God isn't actually moving, if God doesn't take what is dead and bring life out of it, if God isn't coming near to us, then it all is kind of pointless. And I do think in bravery that the pastor, the minister, invites people to lean into that, and also reminds them that it sometimes does take, I don't think this is a cop-out, but it does. God moves on God's own time, So Israel knows really well that to wait on this God is to really wait, and to suffer the waiting. So there isn't this kind of microwave perspective that I think is what pastors really do fear. It's like, okay, let's have people wait for 30 seconds, or we had one Wednesday night and we were in silence for 8 minutes and it didn't work very well, so we're never doing that again. Or really, these are practices you got to take on for a long time, and even say, your children, we believe your children that God is going to move for them, and so let's continue to pray for your children's children. I mean, there's a long view here, I think, that we that we lose inside of this kind of secular age, that we become very tunnel vision because there isn't any meaning out there other than the meaning we make for ourselves. And that means that you have no memory of the past, and whatever the future is, only what you can kind of reach for. It definitely isn't generational. It definitely isn't a kind of long historical reality.
Yeah, it does seem like, often within Christian circles, when people use the language secular, and you've been kind of dissecting that a little bit, they often think of it out there.
Yeah.
That it's something that other people or the rest of the people kind of wrestle through, versus pastors are living and saturated in the secular age, churches, Christians, and this tragic reality, and frankly, living with the title Christian, but as if God doesn't exist. I'm curious if you could give us a couple of examples of where you see this tragically playing out, kind of in the church and context in which we find ourselves most. And I would be really curious if you've seen anybody kind of engage this or respond to this effectively, or like a positive example of someone who recognized, diagnosed, and then, hey, this is beautiful. Look at how they've flourished even in spite of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And, I think it's really important to remember or to realize that the conversation about the secular is not over and against or us, them,
Yes.
I do think we want that all the time. Like, we're church people and we're not secular, they're secular. But one of the great contributions of Charles Taylor's work is like, we're all secular. There's no, when we're thinking in the sense of imaginations here, we're all in it. Like, we all have this kind of secular imagination, and a lot of us would actually choose it in some sense. Like, it's not all bad. Like, there's a couple dynamics at play here, and one of them is this kind of sense of disenchantment that the world, we don't tend to function minute after minute assuming there are devils and demons pulling levers for everything that happens in the world. So when your 11-year-old daughter is having a fit after school every day because she's exhausted, you tend to imagine there are natural and material reasons for these, even maybe psychological reasons. We use words like anxiety and stress, and we even use kind of more popular words like she's hangry. Like they eat lunch too early at school, and by the time she comes home off the bus, she's just angry. We don't tend to think, few of us probably listening to this podcast tend to think, oh, the devil is in our cupboard, and when she goes to get a snack, the devil tempts her. We tend not to think we need an exorcism here, and I would tend to think that it could be very hurtful if every misbehavior that happened with our children, we were calling a Catholic priest to do an exorcism on our house. I don't know why I picked a Catholic priest, just because I know Protestants aren't very good at exorcisms, but I don't know. I have some movie image of a Catholic priest coming in to do an exorcism. So, I think there's some gains in that reality. And by that kind of sense of disenchantment, we all are secular, and we all do tend to inhabit what Taylor calls an imminent frame. We see the world more imminently. So something strange happens, and we tend to presume more natural material answers than supernatural ones. It's harder for us to imagine that. And so we're all kind of secular in that way. So the big question just becomes like, can you, and this is a big question with people who are kind of wrestling with Taylor and people who don't like Taylor or pushing back, is like, how really disenchanted are we? And could you re-enchant the world? Like, could you even maybe in enclaves, say maybe just your church, could you re-enchant it for them? I'm not sure you can, to be honest. I'm more on that you can never necessarily re-enchant the world, because the enchantment's embedded in institution structures, so until airlines are like, come and fly our airline because we cast out demons when we clean the plane, like no one would ever fly that airline, not in the West, maybe in other places in the world, but definitely not in the West. Be like, I am never, ever getting on that airplane, which maybe shows we're also not quite as modern as we think we are. But I don't know that you can re-enchant it, but one of the things you can really do that I think is very important, that takes us beyond Charles Taylor, is I do think you can re-personalize the world. I do think you can soak the world again in a certain sacramental reality, where in that sacramental reality may not be the same medieval imagination where people really did believe really fully. Like, I think some of us still believe that when we take the bread and the wine, that the real presence of Jesus Christ is in it. But they absolutely did, to the point that Keith Thomas, this historian, has told the story. In 13th century England, people were leaving the cathedral with the host still in their mouth, like with the communion bread still in their mouth, so they could take it home and feed it to their pig or put it on their field. Not because they were denigrating or disrespecting it, but because they believed it was magical. They believed it was imbued with power, that their pig would not die and their children would be fed if they fed the host to it. That imagination isn't there for us, but there is a different way of thinking about the sacramental, of how the infinite and the finite can participate in each other. And I do think persons in relationship, deep forms of being cared for by another, of having someone walk with you through your suffering, have someone pray for you as you're going through chemotherapy, have someone hear your confession and tell you that you're forgiven, having someone just journey with you in suffering and in joy, I do think brings something like enchantment back. At the very least, it becomes a place, I think, where God moves, that there becomes this reality of when we give consolation to our neighbor, there's a participation in death that really witnesses to and even becomes a participation in new life that comes out of it. And so you asked for just one example, and I'll just point to one really quickly. Is there's a group out of the UK who kind of fell backward into this practice that they created with young people, really young people that had no connection to a church at all, which was doing this photography and poetry process. And the idea was it was a way of prophetically pushing back against selfie culture. So this guy was just in his village and he was watching all these young people looking at Instagram over and over again. And he felt the call of the Spirit to say something to them, to reach out to them. And so he didn't know what to do. And he's a really great photographer, one of the UK's best photographers. And he walked up to these kids and was like, "Do you want me to teach you how to take great pictures?" And of course, that's catnip to teenagers on social media. Yeah. But he created this whole process where you never take a picture of yourself. Yeah. Someone else sees you. And before they even take that picture of you, you sit down and you have a long conversation and tell each other stories. And then the person who's going to take a picture of you first writes a poem about you. So there's this real dynamic that Karl Barth once talked about how the church has to be a community that sees, that hears and sees and responds in joy. And there's a certain kind of sense of doing that. So it becomes, it's this process called Peel. People can look it up. I think it's Peel Project is the, or Project Peel maybe is the website. But it becomes a really re-personalizing of the world, of creating spaces for persons to encounter each other, not for any instrumental purpose, not like, hey, if they go through this process, then they're going to come here. And then we'll be able to, if we get people to do that, we'll be able to parlay money out of them, or we'll be able to win participation, essentially. It's not about that. It's just about what it means to encounter each other's humanity, and how encountering each other's humanity, there is a deep kind of mystical sense of encountering the very humanity of God in Jesus Christ, who comes near to us, who sees us, who hears us. So that would be one example.
I love that. We'll try to find that and put a link to that project in the show notes. It reminded me, it's so beautiful. I don't remember, it might be Parks and Rec or the sitcom where the character he said that the opposite of a selfie was a Yui. He said it's selfies, but the opposite, but it's like, it's a total inversion, but it speaks to our moment, doesn't it? Where the picture is actually, it's a selfie first. And then the name for all the other pictures, which was what pictures were forever and ever until smartphones could turn around. It's like now the name is about that. It's like it's a Yui, not a selfie.
Every other normal picture is derivative of the selfie, which is the primary.
So it's like actually, it's again, it's a funny kind of sitcom moment, but it is indicative of this this cultural water. So it plays for a laugh, but you're sort of going, wait a second, hold on, what is the story that's telling? And this, I got my start working with middle school and high school students, but I spent, before returning to Christ Community, I spent 3 years working as a college pastor. And that was space for all of this. Andy, your work and how you think, and Taylor, it just was so helpful, because, it was it was a Christian college with a lot of non-Christian students, and the opportunities to sort of exegete and analyze culture with them and ask questions. What stories is it telling? And so all of your work there, so helpful. And I actually wonder for our listeners, so we'll try to find that particular project and link it for people that are interested to look more. But what other resources for those that want to go deeper, go farther? 770 pages in a secular age is a lot. We can link to a secular age in the show notes, but and I'll say, as you're thinking about how to answer around what resources you'd recommend, kind of in the vein of this conversation, that all of your books, I won't make you say that, we'll say it. That's why we invited you to be here with us, is that your work here, we view you as a leader, a thought leader in this space in the best way. And so I'll add that, and we'll link to some of those in the show notes, but others that you've been helped by or would recommend to a thoughtful reading church. That's who we have. And so resources, would love to ask about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to get into this, I mean, it is really, 770 pages is intimidating, but it's worse than that, because you do really need to read the thing 3 times before it really starts to click. So, that really makes you dizzy and, vomit a little bit in your mouth when you think, 3 times through 770 pages. But there are some nice ways in. I think a really good gateway drug into Taylor is a little book that he wrote that was actually lectures that are almost, I almost see them as like he was a seer, like he was a kind of prophetic seer. Wow. They're lectures called, they were lectures called The Malaise of Modernity, but they were published in America as The Ethics of Authenticity. Mm-hmm. And that's really worth kind of dipping your toe into. It's they're written in a way that, well, they were orally given, so they're easier to read, and then you're only looking at 130 pages, not 770. So that's a good way in. James K. A. Smith has a nice little overview called "How Not to Be Secular." That's a very good piece. And then when it comes to Taylor, there are some really good podcasts of Taylor himself talking and being interviewed. And I should probably know these off the top of my head, but it would not take much to just kind of Google those. Yeah. And there are some really, really helpful ones from about 6-7 years ago. I mean, the fascinating thing about Taylor is he's like 94, 95 years old, so and he's still productive and still writing. So it's not his academic work that's amazing. It's like his health and his output at whatever diet he's on. Right. I want to be on that diet. I don't know if he has an avocado shake every morning or something, but I don't know, or a maple syrup Canadian from shake every morning.
North of the border.
Right.
That's
right. He just freebases maple syrup. I don't know.
right out of the tree.
Right. He just sucks it right out of the tree.
Cool. We'll do some work to try to track those down and link them in the show notes as well. No, we'll grab them. That's great. We can do that on the back end. Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah. And as we wrap up today, Andy, a question we ask all of our guests. It's not necessarily when are you going to take a break from God. We're not going to ask you that. But instead, if you could do anything else for work besides the amazing work that you're doing now, what would it be? And maybe to give you a second to think about, maybe you don't. Like for me, that would involve writing poetry, like forever, talking with artists, and then maybe being a bartender. Because you both get to sample the product as well as listen to people. So that would be a little bit of my. So what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I have a very clear one, but it also sets me up to be hated. Or
I can't wait to hear it.
What a great line. Yeah.
Politician. No, I don't mean that. Yeah, that will make you hated no matter what in this day and age. No, I actually do regret in some sense. Not that I want to do anything else with my life. I'm very thankful for the blessings God's given me to do this. Like I know it's an incredible privilege to sit in my monastic cell here in my basement and write books and then talk to folks like you and things like that. So I'm very thankful for that. But I did go to seminary at Fuller in LA, and I just don't know why. Like I didn't start doing like open mics. Like I kind of wish I would have tried to do stand up. Just,
Yes.
I mean, I give a
never
lot of
too late,
presentation
Andy.
to people.
It's never too late.
But here's the thing that I realize now, this has become psychotherapy on me, right?
We're here for it, man.
I feel like the way I try to write my presentations after writing a book, the presentation and the book are different. They're different genres. And I do kind of use, I don't know, my love for stand-up as a kind of way into that. But it also is a very safe way to do it, because at the end of the day, I'm giving you ideas, you know, so hopefully some jokes and some stories, but they're ideas. And I think that what kept me from doing it is probably just ignorance, but also you have to partly love bombing to be a good stand-up.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, you have to take a certain kind of sadistic joy in the whole room turning against you and it not working well. And I don't know if I had the mental constitution for that. You know what I mean? Like,
totally.
the times I've been in a room and you're like, oh my gosh, this is not working, or like at a conference and you see people just streaming out because they're like, this guy, what is he talking about? I just like get flustered, and I think to be a good stand-up, you have to laugh at that and be like, I'm so happy this is happening, because now I get to, you know, sit around and have a drink and we can commiserate about how much I just ate it at that, you know.
It's almost like you need the resilience of a person who tells dad jokes times 5. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, it's going to cause pain to some people, and you're okay with that, you know?
There has to be a level of masochism that I just, my ego, I think, just doesn't have. But I do wish I would have tried, and maybe doing improv too, but I would have liked to try to do stand-up. I wish when I was in my 20s, my mid 20s, I would have just gave it a try. I don't know. So
that's an awesome answer. The line from a comedian that made me think of is, that joke was funnier than you acted. That's what somebody said about, you know, a room that wasn't feeling what he was laying down. So that joke was funnier than you acted. Sometimes I feel like that sermon was better than you. No, it wasn't. Like, as a pastor. But that's interesting, actually. As someone who's heard you give presentations, I think you do weave in really good ways a lot of that in. So that's awesome. But thank you so much for your time.
Now everyone's going to listen to me and be like, that guy's not funny at all. I mean, that's what I mean by people are going to hate me, is I've set myself up to be like, come listen to me talk somewhere. I'm hilarious. And that's the quickest way not to be funny at all.
I think that's what Seinfeld said. He's like, never let anybody introduce you as funny, because then everybody has the bar up here. It's like, you know, the funniest guy is coming out, and he's like, well, I'm about to bomb. People's expectations are through the roof.
I remember that from Seinfeld all the time, because people will come up to me and be like, how do you want me to introduce you? And I'm like, undersell me. Just be like, this guy was our third choice at this conference. This will be okay. And then people will come up to you after and be like, hey, that wasn't too bad. But if you come up and be like, this is the most brilliant dude who's ever existed. This guy, this is going to blow your mind. Then, like Seinfeld said, everyone's sitting back like, oh yeah, we'll see. We'll see how this goes.
We tried to get Charles Taylor for this podcast. No, we didn't. We did not reach out. So, I should have said it on the front end. Thank you, Andy.
This is our fourth choice for this 30 minutes, and hang in there with us, please.
Oh my gosh, Andy, thank you so much. This was a joy, and if nobody else laughs, Gabe and I did. So thank you so much, brother, for taking the time with us.
Oh, it's great to talk with you guys.
Okay, thanks for joining us, and I will see you next time on The Formed Out Life.